Thank you, David. Thank you for coming. I don't think you'll regret being here. I want to introduce my friend and colleague, Robert Nicholson, founding director of the Philos Project in New York City, which perhaps more than most or maybe any other organization is doing things on the ground in the Middle East to help rescue persecuted Christians, and doing things here in this country and other countries to alert Christians to this continuing catastrophe of disappearing Christians from the Middle East. And sadly, what most Christians in this country are largely unaware of, totally unaware of, and pretty much clueless about. And Robert spoke at a Baptist church last night, and he told about his Jewish colleagues telling him the same thing my Jewish colleagues tell me. Why aren't Christians in the United States talking about the horrible persecution of Christians in the Middle East? We Jews do that when our fellow Jews are being persecuted. Why aren't you guys doing it? So, without further ado, let me ask Robert to come up. Former U.S. Marine, Baptist attorney, with degrees in Jewish studies, speaks fluent Hebrew, is in the Middle East much of the time. He's leaving on Sunday for Lebanon. So, Robert.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Am I on? Okay. It's an honor to be here at Beeson. It's my first time here, first time in Alabama. I told the class I spoke to yesterday, so this is all new for me, but it's really great to be here. And it's great to see a room that's mostly full of people who actually want to hear about this, because I hate to say it's not actually the norm. I speak a lot of places, and often this topic doesn't actually generate that much interest among Christians. So just seeing, notwithstanding the buffer, the no man's land between you and me here, it's nice to see you all back there. So I'm Robert Nicholson, a friend of Jerry, most importantly, but I run an organization called the Philos Project. Some of you may know us best for the Passages program that we founded, that we've taken to Beeson. So we brought I think something like 60 Beeson students on 10-day trips to Israel. Similar sorts of things we're talking about today, and we're trying to grow that. Today I'm talking about something related but different. And really what I want to do today is just share a burden of mine and to really try to challenge you in the way that I am constantly challenging myself on this topic of the Middle Eastern church. Christians in the Middle East under persecution, and challenging myself, challenging us as a group. What can we do? What should we do individually, collectively, as the Western church? So we're really talking about, as you know, the body of Christ. And Paul tells us that when one part of the body is suffering, the rest of the body feels it or should feel it and should suffer with it. And that's really where my heart lies today. So I'm not sure if you're aware of this, and I'm going to try to go quickly because I want to leave time for questions. It's difficult to fit this topic into a short time, but I'm going to try. I'm not sure if you know, but even though here we're very comfortable on this beautiful campus with the beautiful chapel that I toured yesterday, one of the most dangerous things to be in this big world of ours is a Christian. For the second year in a row, the Christians are officially the most persecuted religious group in the world. There was a great study that came out earlier this year about 2016 and what happened to Christians during that year. There are 60 countries in the world, worldwide, where Christians are facing moderate to severe persecution. Of course, many of those are in the Middle East. This is a number that may shock you. 90,000 Christians in 2016. 2016, 1 year, 90,000 Christians were killed because they were Christians in that year. Various parts of the world, different circumstances, different killers, but killed for their faith. 1/3 of that number, about 30,000, were killed in the Middle East, which, as you know, is certainly the most gospel-poor, or one of the most gospel-poor parts of the world, and one of the most violent. Beyond that, 600 million Christians scattered all over the globe have been prevented in some way or another from practicing their faith. The Middle East, which is the region I focus on. There's lots of things happening in all kinds of regions in the world. The Middle East is our focus. Really, the Philos Project really exists to sort of make Christian leaders such as yourselves smarter on Middle East issues and connect them more to Middle Eastern people, particularly with other Christians. The Middle East, we think of it today as the Arab world or the Muslim world. It's just sort of what we think of. We think of the Middle East, we think of people in headscarves, people who are praying toward Mecca, and some of you may have forgotten, but it wasn't always that way. The Middle East was a Christian region, a very Christian region, in fact. And where it wasn't Christian, it was Jewish. And there were pockets of paganism on the eve of Islam, but for centuries after Jesus died, that region was filled with churches, filled with bells, filled with liturgy, different rites, different practices, different languages, but very, very immersed in Christianity until the 7th century. Islam came, we all know the story, and surprisingly, I think we all think Islam came, then it was the Muslim world. No, actually it wasn't. Centuries and centuries and centuries passed when the region still was actually mostly Christian and Jewish. The government, the people who were in the bureaucracy, the generals were Muslims. But for a long time, a very long time, the region was still Christian. And that lasted up until the 12th, the 13th, the 14th century. All kinds of things happened I won't go into today. But thus began the beginning of the collapse of Eastern Christianity. And one thing I was in a missions class here yesterday, and I was reminding people, and some of you guys are all smart and you're studying this stuff, and so you may know. But one of the things we forget in the West is that the Eastern Church wasn't a sort of add-on to what was happening in the West. The Eastern Church was ancient, it was vibrant, and it itself was sending missionaries even further east, into India, into China, into Southeastern Asia. And there are communities that are Christian today because of those early missionary efforts. And so we can't forget that these Christians are truly Christian, and when they were able, were truly mission-minded and really bringing the gospel to the uttermost parts of the earth. So Christianity began to shrink in those years, and it continued to shrink over time. And you basically had three options if you were a Christian throughout those subsequent centuries. You could convert. That was the easy way out. You know what? I just don't need this. I don't need the hassle. I don't want to pay this extra tax because I'm a second-class citizen. I don't want to have to get off my horse when a Muslim's approaching and get down on my knees so that I can show him honor. I don't want to wear this certain sort of clothing and blue turban to signify, I don't need any of it. I just want to be a regular guy. I want my family to have access to all of the wonderful things in society. I'm going to become a Muslim. There's no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet. Okay, done. I'm in. It's done. And many, many, many Christians converted. As you can tell, the region is not majority Christian today. Many, many Christians, those who were under duress, those who were weak in their faith, left the faith. They gave it up and they became Muslims. That was one option. And over time, in the aggregate, it turned out to be probably the most taken option. The second option was to flee, to sort of separate yourself. The Muslims, they control the cities, they control the lowlands. We're going to run for the hills, literally. And what you find is there's a sort of crescent, the hill country of the northern Mesopotamia, stretching from sort of northern Israel, Lebanon, northern Syria, southern Turkey, northern Iraq, northwestern Iran. There's a crescent of Christianity there, not coincidentally, because that was the high country. Those were the places where you can sort of hide and do your own thing, and the people down there wouldn't bother you. And so some of the most robust remaining pockets of Christianity in the region are in those mountains across the northern Middle East. The third option was to sort of keep your head down and be a Christian, but kind of integrate in society or just stay out of everybody's way. The Copts, I think, were the biggest community that took this route. You're in the Nile Valley. There's not a whole lot of places to go. There's literally one green strip in Egypt from north to south. Beyond that is desert. If you're going to live there, you just got to suck it up and live in the Muslim society. And they did, and they managed this sort of stay out of everyone's way. We'll do our own thing. We'll kind of be in our own neighborhoods. Don't mind us. We're not going to cause any trouble. And by that strategy, they've managed to survive and still remain one of the largest concentrations of Christians in the Middle East. The Orthodox community, meaning the Greek, the Byzantine Orthodox Church, has distinguished them from the Oriental Orthodox churches. They also sort of stayed in the cities and kind of kept their head down and tried to integrate into society. One thing I want to mention in terms of the integration, that's going to bring us up a little bit until today, was something that happened in the beginning of the 20th century that was called Arab nationalism. I don't know how many, I know you guys aren't here to study geopolitics and Middle Eastern whatever, but just a little bit about Arab nationalism. Arab nationalism was largely a project to change the way the Middle East worked. For the whole history of the Middle East after the coming of Islam, the Middle East, the various governments and empires that ruled it were all sort of, it was a normative Islamic government. Muslims had first-class citizenship, non-Muslims had second. And it took different forms in different eras. But that was the basic gist of it. If you're a Christian, you just can't be at the same level as everyone else. The move that Arab nationalism made was to say, you know, we don't have to do this along religious lines. We could do this along ethnic lines. I speak Arabic, I'm a Christian. You speak Arabic, you're a Muslim. Maybe our religious identity is less important than what we share in our Arabism. And actually, it was Christians, particularly Greek Orthodox Christians, who were the intellectual forefathers. And they were being seeded, by the way, by a lot of Protestant missionaries, particularly in Beirut and in parts of Syria, who were, that's a long sort of story that needs to be written, but were very involved in sort of helping these Greek Orthodox thinkers shape their ideas about Arab identity. And it was an attempt to shift the way the Middle East worked. And for a while it worked. The Middle East, Arab nationalism sort of had its heyday in the first half of the 20th century. When people started to say, look, you know, Muslim, Christian, whatever, we're Arabs, we speak Arabic, we have respect for this tradition, and we're just going to sort of work together. The most famous father of Arab nationalism was a guy named Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was the president of Egypt. He was sort of the poster boy for this movement. The problem was Arab identity was very weak. You know, among elites, among people who were writing books, it was a great idea, it seems. But once you got outside the city, outside the university, people still were like, look, I'm a Muslim and you're a Christian, so like that's just the way it is. And what happened is Arab nationalism sort of collapsed. The one thing that really kept it all together, beyond the Arab language, the Arabic language, was opposition to Israel and to the West. They said, look, there's a lot of stuff we disagree with as Arabs, but you know, we can agree on the language and we can agree on who the enemy is, and it's Israel and it's sort of Western friends who planted it here. And so Israel kind of remained, in the inverse of that, the cause of the Palestinians remained kind of the flagship Arab issue Christians and Muslims could get behind, and it was a way to sort of rally themselves together, even as the internal workings of their society were deeply problematic. And so the height of the Arab nationalism was just before the 1967 war, when Nasser and the ruler of Syria said, we are going to once and for all, you know, Arabs, oh Arab people, we are going to finally, you know, right the wrong that was done in 1948. We are going to rid our region of this Jewish cancer, and they sort of lined their armies up along the border. And it seemed for Arab nationalism, this was the moment, sort of this was going to be the new wellspring for this identity. And unfortunately for that movement, Israel they sort of looked at it and they said, well, you know, we could sit here and wait for them to fire the first shot, but you know, we could also just sort of do it ourselves. And so Israel, in the course of 6 days, just utterly destroyed the Egyptian Air Force and the Syrian Air Force, and we all know what happened in the 1967 war. And what happened was Arab nationalism began to collapse, which, if you're a Christian in the Middle East, was really your last hope for being part of this society. And as Arab nationalism collapsed, the pre-existing Islamic identity that had been the normative identity and the normative governing structure of the Middle East for, you know, centuries came back with a vengeance. And the big sort of breakthrough was the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979, and things just started happening around the region that made it worse and worse. As the Shiites grew in fervency, the Sunnis decided to grow no less, until you have this place today where we're basically in the midst of an Islamic civil war. You know, we often think, well, you know, the Middle East, they hate us. A lot of the Middle East hates itself. You know, they hate each other much more than they hate us. And what happens is Christians get caught in the middle of this. They are seen in different ways as agents of the West or as a fifth column of some way. It didn't help that after the Iraq War, or during the Iraq War, many Christians served with American military as translators, as sort of assistants and all of that. And the Americans, when we got sick of it over there, we sort of pulled out, and there were the Iraqi Christians left standing. And we as Americans, you know, we're not Christian. We're absolutely not Christian. We are a secular country. We like everybody. We're not going to make any special favors for Christians because that would be wrong. And so when petitioned by the Christian communities of Iraq from 2003 on to like make special protections, special provisions for Christians and for Yazidis, by the way, and other sort of smaller non-Islamic communities in the north, the U.S. really didn't want to have anything to do with it. So you can think the Iraq War was wonderful. It was not wonderful. But the fact of the matter is we did not take the precautions we needed to protect the minorities that we, in different ways, put in danger. In Iraq, I mean, I think the best statistic is the one that's most often cited. Iraq had a massive Christian population, 1.5 million people in 2003. And today there are maybe 200,000 left. The violence, the sectarian warfare, certainly not our fault, but something that we weren't trying to guard against, that happened after 2003 just destroyed that very, very ancient community. I want to talk a little bit about a couple of different countries and what's happening in them. I want to talk about sort of where this leaves us and kind of what we can do with this information. Then I want to talk a little bit about sort of a call to action, and I want to take questions. But before I want to do that, I want to show you a 2-minute trailer of a film that we've been involved in that I'm an associate producer on called Faith Keepers. It would be my greatest joy to do an event here at Beeson, a much bigger event, to show this film and to organize a prayer event around this film. Really in 1 hour tells the story through stories, through great video, visuals, animations about really what's happening in this region right now, sort of in our own time. So I'm going to show this clip and then I'll come back up here and give a little more detail. All set? Push play.
The current status of Christians and other non-Muslim minorities throughout the Middle East is the worst it's been in centuries.
21 people were killed when a powerful bomb exploded in front of a Coptic Christian church.
Muslim mobs began attacking Christian churches.
They are targeting churches, temples, cultural, historical sites.
سوريا وأنا لك بخاز شو سوريا جو العراق قتل خله.
يعني بأخذوني بالقوة واغتصبوني وتقريبا 4 أيام 5 أيام رجعت للبيت. هو كان بسيارته راجع من شغله، لزموا ايده ورجله ورايدوا يقطعوا راسه.
I converted from Islam to Christianity. I was arrested, and after that they gave me a death penalty. What I told the judge in this day, if loving and worshiping Christ is a crime, I am guilty as charged.
The Christians of Iraq and Syria who fled ISIS narrowly escaped a genocidal campaign of mass murder, of crucifixions, and of beheadings.
Now we are here in Kawa Center for youth. We have here 186 caravan, 260 families here.
What is taking place in the Middle East, particularly in Iraq, is genocide.
They call this ethnic cleansing. This is the real word.
The administration is failing, the Congress is failing, and quite frankly, with all due respect, the church is failing.
In response to persecution, I always want to tell people to pray. Stop, pray. Be burdened for your brother and sister, but get involved in the fight and help.
And doesn't matter how small is your voice, you can make a difference, even if you are just one person.
So this film, it's going to be officially released very soon. Is to me probably the best tool. You know, you guys are going to be pastors, is my understanding, missionaries, ministry workers of various kinds. Not everybody needs to be an expert on the Middle East and Christians of the Middle East to get this issue into your church or into your community. You can show this film. We have a prayer kit that we actually, it's a literal kit. It's a box that has posters and prayer guides and all of this stuff. Everything one needs to bring this issue into your church or your community. I'll talk a little bit about that after, but you can see, this is a tip of the iceberg, these stories. I mean, they're the most gruesome, heart-wrenching stories you'll ever hear. And one of the things that I try to remind a Western audience who, sees this, it's very foreign, even the Christian communities themselves they don't seem connected to sort of who we are. And it's a story I told last night at this Baptist church about these women I met who, Iraqi women, Christian women, Assyrian women. By the way, the languages you were hearing in this film were not Arabic, that was Aramaic. This is the language that these communities still speak. These two women, old women, basically had to flee with none of their worldly possessions in the middle of the night as ISIS was rolling in to the Nineveh Plain, which is sort of the heartland of the Assyrian Christian church in Iraq. They had to flee, their families, the kids. I mean, everybody was sort of racing pell-mell out of the Nineveh Plain toward the line of Kurdistan to seek safety with the Kurds. And these people were saying that, for us, we think ISIS, that's the beginning of the persecution of Christian story. These people, before ISIS, it was Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Before that, it was Saddam Hussein. And before that, it was something else. These people, every single person in the Middle East, Christian, will tell you how many martyrs they have in their family. And they're not talking about their brothers and sisters. Their memories go back generations. They remember when the Turks did this, or when, back in the 1700s, when the Druze of Lebanon sort of came into their village and started butchering people. Everybody has a story, many stories, and they're all extremely poignant, to say the least. And these two women, I asked the translator, I said, ask her if she was, these two women, ask them if they were ever tempted to just say, you know what, I'm a Muslim, leave me alone, I'll be fine. They'd be left alone. ISIS would be like, welcome in, you're full part of this community. Were they ever tempted to give up Christ? And they looked at me like I was absolutely insane. And they said, are you kidding me? There is nothing for us in this world apart from Christ. This is an Iraqi Christian woman speaking in Aramaic to me, a Westerner who thinks, my Christianity is very well developed and, I'm very strong in my faith. This woman, facing weapons, facing guns, facing death, or the choice of converting, said, I'd rather face death, and with happiness. She couldn't even contemplate the question. It was a very powerful moment for me. So real quick, we'll talk about Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Egypt, Lebanon, a little bit about Iran. Just sort of a quick sort of dash through the region. I'm not going to touch on anything beyond the most basic details. But Iraq obviously is one of the hardest hit because it had one of the largest Christian communities. I'm not going to go way back. Let's just talk about ISIS. As I said, most of these people lived in the north. Many of them were from Baghdad, but when Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Abu Musab al-Zarqawi was bombing things in Iraq, bombing churches, many of them moved back to the north, to their sort of ancestral homeland, only to find that the sort of jihadists found them there as well. So every story you'll hear from these Christians when ISIS came, it was the middle of the night, they're in the Nineveh Plain, and there's a bunch of villages in the Nineveh Plain. It's an actual plain, as you can imagine, outside Nineveh, which is what we call Mosul today, southeast of Mosul. And the Iraqi, everybody knew there were bad guys on the horizon. The Iraqi security forces withdrew. The Kurdish Peshmerga security forces withdrew. And these Christians are literally sitting there in the way of ISIS with no guns, no guys in trucks, no defenses whatsoever. And in the middle of the night, the church bell started ringing, and everybody is screaming over the microphone, go, go, go. Don't grab anything, get your kids, get your family, and get in your car and go. Every family you meet will tell you that same story. And they were in different villages, but it was the same story. And they did. They got in their car, terrified for their life. Some of them didn't make it. They left too late. and they were killed. Some of the women faced some really, truly horrific things, and they sought safety in Kurdistan, where they went into camps, and I've been in these camps many times, and they are everything you can imagine in a refugee camp. Some of them didn't even make it to camps. They were living in sort of half-built malls and in fields, and you see their tents on the side of the road. Family, like huge families too, lots of kids living in really, really, truly awful conditions. Many of them want to go back home. And recently, we've actually had a lot of success against ISIS, and people have actually started to move back to the Nineveh plain. There's actually even, I heard, I was shocked, 7 families who moved back to Mosul itself, which was the place where everybody knows they spray painted the Nun, the Arabic letter N for Nasara, which means Christian, on the homes. Neighbors. It wasn't ISIS who painted those N's on the houses. It was the neighbors of the people who used to live there. The neighbors who were Muslims, they were Christian. The neighbors marked it and said, there's a Christian living here. And you can imagine what happened. So where are they now? There are about 25,000 people who've come back to the Nineveh plain. There are 60,000 Christians still in the Kurdish area, which lies to the east of that, where there's sort of a whole other story of discrimination. 60,000 waiting in camps in the Kurdish regional government area. As I said, there's 7 families that went back to Mosul. There's about 20,000 that fled to Jordan. And what you should know about Christian refugees in the Middle East, they're unlike the standard refugees. They don't go to refugee camps. They don't get in the UN system and get access to all of the wonderful things that the UN system brings. A ticket to the West, Band-Aids, medical care, education. They're terrified to be in a gigantic camp with Muslims. I mean, that's just the reality. You can like that or not like that, but that's the reality. So they settle in slums in cities of the Middle East, in Beirut, in Amman, and even in Syria, believe it or not. And so you have 20,000 in Jordan. We've done a lot of work with them. And they're basically living in the slums of Amman. You have 15,000 in Lebanon from Iraq. Moving to Syria, where, as you can imagine, the Syrian civil war has done its own damage to Christian communities there. You have about 200,000 Christians from Syria who've also fled into Lebanon. Lebanon is a tiny little country. As Jerry said, I'll be there on Sunday. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But you can imagine a little country, smaller than New Jersey, just inundated with refugees, unable to provide basic services, and these people are suffering as a result. In Turkey, you still have about 120,000 Christians. The Islamist government of Turkey has become increasingly Islamist and intolerant, so much so that they seized. There's a very sort of famous, you think of Rome, you think of Mount Athos. There's a very famous sort of center of Syriac Orthodoxy in a place called Tur Abdin, which means mountain of the servants. And this is a sort of a heartland, up in the hills and the mountains, beautiful sort of unbelievable sort of Lord of the Rings kind of landscape up there. And Turkey has seized massive amounts of church property, this is in recent weeks, with no explanation, and plans to convert them into mosques. I mean, this is not dramatic. This is actually what's happening. So Christians in Turkey are caught up also in sort of the Turkish, Kurdish stuff. Christians are always the nice people in these societies. This is a subjective statement, but it's true. They're like, look, don't get us involved. We don't want to be part of all your nonsense. But nevertheless, they're always dragged back in. Egypt, still one of the largest centers of Middle East Christianity, the Coptic Church, mostly Coptic Orthodox, but also Coptic Protestant, Coptic Latin Catholic. The ISIS problem, as ISIS has been defeated as a center, it's kind of lashed out around the world. We've seen them launching attacks in Spain and parts of Europe, and another place that they do it is in Egypt. And really what they want to do is undermine sort of the fragile Egyptian social order, where Christians are still somewhat protected, at least by law, if not in practice. So you have about 10 to 15% of the Egyptian population, which is quite large for the Middle East, about 8 million Christians or more in Egypt, who are really in fear for their lives. You guys probably saw just not long ago, the Palm Sunday bombing of the Egyptian church, where 45 people were killed literally on Palm Sunday in the middle of the service. 125 were injured. Lebanon is a very unique case. I'll talk about that for a minute. I'm getting close to time here. I want to go quickly. The closest thing to a Christian country in the Middle East. There's about 30 to 40% of the Lebanese population is Christian, It's really all about a mountain where the Christians hid, called Mount Lebanon, in the northern part of the country. It's sort of the Maronite stronghold. I'm sure you guys know who the Maronites are. But Lebanon is not only facing these waves of refugees that's burdening their economic system, but there is also a rise of sort of non-state kind of Islamic terrorism in that country as well. It has to do with Iran. Iran's kind of expanding hegemony in the country, really forcing Christians into a much more subservient role, and they are kind of losing their country. The Lebanese Christians have always felt like they had Lebanon. By law, the president has to be a Christian, and Christianity is very sort of steeped in the culture, but because of this broader sectarian war that's taking place around the region, the Christians of Lebanon too, the last big holdout where Christians actually had some power, some strength, they are being undermined as well. So the purpose of my trip on Sunday is to meet with Christian leaders, political leaders, religious leaders, including the Maronite Patriarch, and to figure out, okay, what is the message I'm bringing back to the West, and how can we in the Western Church begin to speak out, advocate for you here in this country? All that bad news. There is a little bit of good news I want to say quickly. There are millions and millions of foreign workers who are not of Middle Eastern descent living in the Middle East. A lot of Filipinos. I always say Filipinos run the Middle East in some way. If you go into these big households, there's always like a Filipino guy who's running the whole show. Many of them, if not most of them, are Christians. And there's others from India as well. This is like underground. They're all through the Gulf. Christians are everywhere. Deeply discriminated against. You know, you can't build a church. If you're a worker in Saudi Arabia, you can't be building a church. You're worshiping in homes quietly for fear of being arrested. There is a very sort of effervescent sort of movement of these foreign Christians in the Middle East. So you're having Christians, the ancient churches are leaving, and then sort of from the other side, you have Christians coming in, which I think probably God has something to do with. Together with that, you have this sort of explosion, I'm sure many of you have heard of this, of the gospel being spread underground in parts of the Middle East. Iran is really the best example of this. Iran has had a massive explosion of conversions from Islam to Christianity in recent years. There's estimates that by 2020 you'll have about 7 million, or about 10% of the Iranian population will be Christian. And it's sort of a revolution, sort of a counter-Islamic revolution that's happening. And similar things are happening all over the region through Arabic language satellite television and things of that nature. So God is working in the Middle East, not only with, trying to protect the ancient churches, but bringing in, new blood, as it were, even in the midst of this conflict. So, the Western Church. The first thing, people ask me, so like, look, it's humongous, it's big, like I don't run America or the U.S. military, like what do you want me to do about it? Like I can't really help. And I understand that sense of being overwhelmed. Having said that, and I know with all due respect to Jeff King, who said here, stop praying, have a burden, you got to pray. And don't pray like we tend to pray when we tell our buddy, hey man, I'm going to pray for you, I know you're having it, like, no, I'm talking about like serious devotional prayer on a consistent basis about what God would have you do in your own life. Let's talk just about you individually, in your own life about this issue. This is, in my mind, and I don't think I'm overstating it, the most, if you're a Christian living today, this is the biggest thing going. We're all sort of in our denominational circle, in our church circle, we're learning, we're working, we're busy, we're all doing all kinds of things. And I think sometimes we forget that the church is a global body, and the part of the body that's in the Middle East is suffering tremendously. To be a Christian, to be a good Christian, and to be ignoring this plight is, I think, really an abdication of our duty. And I think that at the very least, we should be praying in a serious, sincere, and fervent way about what God will have us do individually. I mean, for you guys are studying, you guys are planning your future. Not all of you will do something on this topic, but some of you will, or some of you should. And I would challenge you as you're thinking about your future, your studies, to begin thinking about, okay, what could I do in a big way for the Eastern Church that's suffering today? One of the things, these are some standard points. In addition to praying, giving. Okay, fine, we're giving. So what? So these people, as you can imagine, have tremendous physical needs. I think a lot of people want, immediately when they think of giving to the Middle East, they think of missions giving, and that's important. As you heard, there's huge things happening because of that. But if we're only doing the Great Commission and not the greatest commandment, then we're really kind of dropping the ball as well. So we've sent lots of money to build trailer caravans for these people, to send food. Getting your church to give even $500, you know, as a whole, is a win. And I think that, you know, if we truly love our brothers and sisters, we, like the early church, will also be giving to help their needs. There's ways to do it that are small, there's ways to do it that are big and huge, but they're all very important. The other thing is, the last thing is to be speaking out and advocating. So we do a lot of advocacy at Philos Project, I understand, especially as churches and seminary students, you know, getting involved in sort of advocacy is not the first thing you think about, but urging, calling upon, and I could send anyone who's interested more information, calling upon our government to draft an official sort of minority protection policy. There's nothing quite like this in the United States. We have sort of religious freedom stuff that we do, but we've never really said on the record, and never backed it up with any of the billions of dollars in foreign aid that we send. We've never really said on the record, we care about minorities in this region. We feel an obligation to them, Christians, but also other groups as well. Getting your church, getting your community involved, calling upon the government. I think that's a perfect role for the church. I don't know that the church should go much further beyond that, but I think that's something that the church, using its moral authority, is able to do. At the very least, what you can do is to zoom out from your current moment. You're a Baptist, you're a Presbyterian, you're a Catholic, you're Orthodox, whatever you are, the whole Christian world doesn't live or die on whatever theological, you know, argument that you're in at the given moment. There's a big, big world out there. There's big, big things happening. God is moving in the Middle East. The gospel came out of the Middle East. It went east, but it also went west, and I think in a lot of ways it's sort of coming full circle. This is the centerpiece, I think, for what God's going to do in the next century. And however big or small you work that into what you're doing, you will be, I think, on the right side of God's activity here in this day and age. What I'd love to do, a very specific thing, and this is up to the powers that be in the room, I'd love to do a bigger event here at Beeson. Philos could sponsor it or put it on, really just to show this movie, to organize a sort of a corporate prayer event, and to really, in a formal way, in a specific way, introduce this idea to the student body or whatever portion of the student body is interested, and to begin to really challenge each other about what we should do. And of course, we can bring in speakers. Some of the people you've even seen in this clip are available to come in. So with that, I will end. I have 10 minutes. That was incredible. I got through that. There's a lot that I didn't cover. There's probably other things that you're interested in hearing about. So we have a microphone. I don't know if we have a Sherpa to bring it around, but this fine gentleman here. Thank you. Any questions you have? Practical, philosophical, whatever. Yes, sir, here in the front.
Would you say that between the animosity between Shiites and Sunnis, that the Christians end up being sort of scapegoated? Like, I think of Nazi Germany, that, you know, the Jews would be scapegoated, blamed for anything that goes wrong. Is that sort of a dynamic that's going on with Christians in the Middle East?
Right. So they don't scapegoat Christians for being, like the Shiites don't scapegoat them as being pro-Sunni and vice versa. They both scapegoat them for the same reason, which is to say they're sort of agents of Western meddling, right? They're sort of they're Americans, you know, sort of in disguise, and they serve as a fifth column in society. Now, what happens is, like in Lebanon is a perfect example. Once the Americans pulled out, once the Israelis pulled out, the Lebanese Christians really had a choice. There was only one choice, and that was, which side are you going to side with? The Sunnis and the Shiites in the country were deadlocked, and what you had is a situation where the Christian groups, they kind of split. One group kind of sided with the Sunnis, and one group kind of sided with the Shiites because they offered them protection. I mean, it was kind of a survival option. And so in that country, there are pro-Sunni Christians and pro-Shiite Christians, which kind of complicates this even more. So you actually have a situation where it's kind of Christians against Christians. And this has been a very effective tactic throughout Middle Eastern history, is that the reigning governments kind of turn Christians against each other. They'll co-opt one group, offer them sort of special protections, and turn that group against sort of the rest of the Christian body. And so you're sort of splitting it and then splitting it again from within. So that sectarian problem definitely manifests itself in Christian communities, definitely. Yes, in the back.
You've urged us to pray, but also to give. Can you tell us where to give, where we know that most of that money is going to the cause rather than being ripped off by these organizations?
So we're not active on the ground. We give to people on the ground. So you can give to us, and we don't take anything from it. We give it directly to the organizations. One of the greatest organizations you can give to, and the one that we may end up giving it to if you give it to us, is actually there was a woman speaking on this film. She runs something called the Iraqi Christian Relief Council. And it's project-based. So right now she's working on, it's called Operation Return to Nineveh. And this is sort of helping these people as they're moving back to their homes, their villages, to sort of fix their houses, fix their places of worship, and set up electricity, some of the most basic things that you and I take for granted. And she takes nothing off the top. She doesn't even take a salary. It's a very lean organization. It's Iraqi Christian Relief Council. I think they're at victimsofisis.org. There are others, but the bigger they are and the more notable they are, the less money gets. Sort of this weird paradox, right? Where big, flashy organizations with amazing websites had to pay for that website. And so that's a little bit less money to the Christians on the ground. So I personally would recommend Iraqi Christian Relief Council. Yes, ma'am.
When did you say that film will be released?
That film, the film will be released early in 2018. But we are able to show it because we're involved in it and funded part of it. We're able to show it.
Will it be available for purchase?
Yes.
Just circulate for
Yes.
purchase?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. You. My website, just for in general, my website is philosproject.org, PHILOS project.org, and my email address, if you want to email me directly, so I can give you any information, is my first name Robert at philosproject.org. That's for anything that you guys want to talk about after. Time for maybe a couple more questions. Is that right, Dr. Parks? Okay. In the front.
What's the difference between the Shiite and the Sunni? You said they're always fighting against one another and they side with each other. What's the difference?
It's a really, for us, it's a very obscure argument over, really, just to boil it down very simply, about succession within the Muslim world. The big question was, who's going to rule the Ummah, which is the Muslim world? The Shiites said it has to be a direct biological descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. And they sided with his son-in-law, I'm going to get this wrong, Ali, who was killed by the people that later, Sunnis said, no, that's not how it works. It's not direct succession. We're not running a monarchy here. It's a much different kind of model than the Shiites. The Shiites are a vast minority in the Middle East. So of all Muslims, Shiites make up something like 15%. So the Sunnis are the majority. The Shiites have always felt themselves persecuted. And so when Saddam Hussein was toppled in Iraq, he was a Sunni. And he and his Sunni minority had been ruling over a country that's actually a majority Shiite. So once the Sunnis were taken out of power in Iraq, the Shiites were like, this is good, you know, we're going to run this show. And there was this thing that happened where the Shiites took over, and they were like, you know, they had a chip on their shoulder. They'd been ruled by a Sunni, Saddam Hussein, for decades. And the Sunnis, in response, kind of battened down the hatches, and they started what became Al-Qaeda in Iraq and then ISIS. So there's this, you know, constant kind of cycle of violence that's happening. They don't want to be controlled by the other. That's the worst thing that can happen. I thought I saw a hand somewhere. Any other questions?
Give us your email again.
It's robert@philosproject.org. Yes, sir.
You can be brief, but how did you get into this? Like, how did you get interested in persecution?
Oh, look at that. Okay. So I can really be long-winded here. So I came to faith, I have a weird, it's part of my testimony, right? So I was baptized Catholic, raised, my mother sort of became unchurched evangelical. I had no interest in it for forever until my early 20s when I began to read scripture as an intellectual exercise and try to figure out, what are the claims of Christianity. I'm reading every other religion, like what's the Christian thing? And I had studied a lot of ancient Near Eastern religions, and when I read the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, I was immediately struck at how different it was from all the other ancient Near Eastern religious texts that I had read. It was just a totally different document, saying different things, making different claims, and it was enough of a hook to get me to keep reading. And I was struck by this fact that I think I mentioned, that Christianity is in fact a Middle Eastern religion. And I never thought about it. I think about it as being, American, evangelical something. But the more I encountered the Middle Easternness of Christianity, the more intrigued I became. I immediately bumped into the Jews and realized, wow, the Jewish contribution to this is quite significant. And although we disagree over the person and the mission of the Messiah, there's actually, we share something unique. We share a text, which is something we don't share with Muslims or really any other group. And very shortly after that, I ran into the Eastern Church and was like, wow, there's this whole world of Christians in the Middle East that I didn't know. And I started to look around the church in America, and like, where's the place, who are the people that are really sort of bringing all of this together and really talking about it in a serious way and trying to be a force for good on these issues. And like, I would find little things here and there, but nobody in my mind was being really holistic about it. Thinking about this from a place of orthodoxy, thinking about it sort of in a big, find people who work on Israel issues, people who work on the persecuted church, but nobody's really sort of telling one big story and how it's relevant to me in America. So, there's lots of different things happened. I learned Hebrew, there's this whole thing. And really, I've had this opportunity to sort of fill gaps by founding a new organization, and that was Philos. So we're trying to, educate a new generation of Christians to really understand this part of the world, to help the Middle East, but also to be helped by the Middle East. By going east, in some ways, I think we're better equipped to save the West. There's a lot over there that we've forgotten that we should try to remember. Yes, ma'am.
Are there a couple of books that you would like to, if you could help
Yes.
to the church?
Well, I'm glad you asked. Well, the Bible, yes, read the Bible. No, this book, you're not going to get access to this cool thing that I did yesterday, but I did a giveaway in the missions class, so they're getting a free copy of this book. This is the best book of sort of the story in one volume of the Middle Eastern church and what it's faced. It's called The Lost History of Christianity. Has anybody read this book? Dr. McDermott? Oh, you guys got to read this book. This book is really powerful. It's by Philip Jenkins, who's you may know him from other books on world religions and world Christianity. But the subtitle is the 1,000-year golden age of the church in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, and how it died. And he goes all the way back to the beginnings, especially of Syriac Christianity, the big missions movement I talked about, and then sort of takes it all the way up. Really well-researched and very accessible book. So this is, I think, if I had to recommend one book, it's this book, which is why I brought it. Thank you for asking that.
Robert, you're talking about these Eastern Orthodox, and they're mostly Eastern Orthodox Christians of various sorts of orthodoxy, capital O. But are they really Christians? Don't they teach salvation by works? And if they do, that's a repudiation of the true gospel. So how can you call them Christians?
I feel like you're trying to provoke me, Dr. McDermott. Well, look, I wrote an article for Canon and Culture a couple of years ago. It's called 7 Lame Excuses Why Western Christians Won't Help Eastern Christians. And one of the things that some people don't say, but some people do, is that, I'm looking at these guys, they don't look very Christian to me. They seem like they're all about works. Look, there's different traditions, right? So there are Roman Catholics there are Protestants there in the Middle East, and not a small number of them. There are sort of Byzantine or Greek Orthodox, but there's also this whole other movement that split off after the Council of Chalcedon was sort of the fork in the road for them. They split off before, and they're called the Oriental Orthodox churches. These are the Copts, the Armenians, the Syriac Orthodox, the Assyrian Church of the East, the Abyssinians, the Ethiopian Church. I can't speak for all of them, and I admit that there are, just as there are here in America, lots of cultural Christians who think of themselves as Christians just because they're not Muslims. There are some of those people, and I've met them. But you will be shocked, and I would challenge you to reach out to Christians Middle East Christians in your own communities, because you don't have to go to the Middle East to find Middle East Christians. This is like the dirty little secret. There's probably a Middle Eastern church somewhere around your house. I would urge you to reach out and at the very least start to build a friendship with those people, and just to say, hey, I'm here, I heard about you guys, I want to say I'm like here in your community. Anything I can do, let me know. When you talk to these people, you will be shocked by a number of things. These people are certainly deeply devout in their prayer lives, in their attachment to Scripture, which is, I think, for me, the biggest thing that shocked me, but also, and I think, a very grace-based view of salvation. I mean, there's definitely a sacramental aspect to them, and if you're a Protestant, that may be desirable or not. But when you talk to these people, I mean, like these two women I mentioned, people for whom Christ is the end-all, be-all of their salvation, and that's exactly why they haven't given him up. And they don't see, you know, their attendance at Mass as the reason they're going to heaven. It is because of what Christ did on the cross. I would challenge you to ask those questions. I think it's a good question. And I think that you'll be surprised by the answer. But at the very least, I'll say one more thing. You know, you mentioned the Jews who asked me this question. Don't you Christians? I was speaking about, I'll tell you a little bit about the story real quick. I was speaking about Israel at a conference about Israel. And a Jewish guy got up and he's like, I'm so glad you like Israel, but what about the Christians? Like, you're a Christian. Don't you care about Middle Eastern Christians and how they're being persecuted? Which was like, you know, thankfully I had done a lot of work and I was like, you know, actually we do a lot. Here's the story. But it's a real thing. And I think for people standing on the outside, Jews, but also Muslims, but also people who are secular, regardless of, let's just put aside this sort of view of salvation, etc. But even if everybody over there, which is not true, is just cultural or workspace, whatever you want to call it, for the sake of the name of God, for the sake of the name of Christ, in the eyes of the nations, even for that reason alone, we as the global church should be standing up for them. Because it's not up to us to decide who's getting in and who's getting out, but it is our job to make sure that the name of Christ is being sanctified and represented here in the world today in front of all the people who don't believe in him. So that Jewish person, he's not going to care about the works-based, grace-based. He's just going to look and be like, wow, to be a Christian is to be nothing. Like Christians don't even care about Christians. Why would I be a Christian? That's the reality. I think we're done. Guys, thank you so much for coming. It's great to meet you. Please be in touch, anything you need.